Welcome to OrthoEpidemiology, Module 7, where we will be looking at how to write a scientific paper. Now clearly, how you go about writing a paper may differ, and this talk will include a lot of generality. Writing a paper for the first time, or even the 50th, can be a daunting prospect. You have spent countless hours poring over the data. You have a lot to say. How are you going to convey the information quickly, concisely, and with the greatest amount of retention from the intended audience for the main idea? How are you going to sell your product to a journal and convince reviewers that the material is worthwhile? I'd like to teach you hopefully what I learned largely from Richard Brand, the former editor of Clinical Orthopedics and Related Research, on how to write a paper. I didn't learn directly from him, but rather from writing for papers to be published in Core, through his carrying critique of each paper which got consideration for Core. He is a quintessential editor. I don't think there's any one way to write a good paper, but the way I will present is an amalgamation of things I learned from him and others on how to ask a question and answer it with data. This is the purpose of writing a scientific paper, regardless of methodology. He has written an excellent paper on how to write papers specifically for Core, but I think it is a good method altogether. If you want his words directly, I've placed a reference for his paper in the description below. While I don't think this is the only way a scientific paper can be written, it contains several key principles that will help you as you write papers for scientific journals. As mentioned in Module 1, the most critical part of the paper, and indeed the whole process, is to have a clinically relevant and interesting question. This question will be the centerpiece of the introduction portion of the paper, and in fact the entire paper. Every word in the introduction should frame the question. The introduction should be concise and pithy. The rationale for asking the question should be well explained. Use the introduction to build your case for why your paper is needed and what niche it fills in the literature. This, of course, presumes that you have done a thorough lit review and your senior author has a good grip of the available literature on the subject, which should be a prerequisite of writing a paper. You should make yourself an expert on the topic. The introduction to the paper should be incredibly brief, 3 to 4 paragraphs at the most. From a gamesmanship perspective, the reader should come away with a very clear idea of, number 1, what your question is, number 2, why the question matters, number 3, what the background data and previous work is, and number 4, what you propose to do and what your hypothesis is, and what you think the answer is a priori. Consider this introduction to the FAITH trial, which is a very well-funded, very complex, multi-center randomized controlled trial. Note how short the introduction is. Keep in mind, the authors aim to examine a sliding hip screw construct versus a standard of care screw fixation for femoral neck fractures, with reoperation rate as their primary outcome. They use the first paragraph to frame the question, describing the burden of hip fractures. Next, they describe why they chose reoperation rates as their outcome, and finally, why surgeons have sought a better answer than the standard of care. In other words, they frame the question, and they give the reader a very clear idea of why they are doing the study. In their second paragraph, they give a brief idea of what they think the intervention group is reasonable and why they think there is equipoise between the two treatments and why the trial is warranted. Here they sell what their niche is in their study. Lastly, in the final paragraph, they are very clearly spell out what their question is and by what metric they will judge success or failure. This introduction is perfect, and keep in mind it is for a very high budget randomized controlled trial. Long intros tend to be red flags as to the author's lack of confidence in their question and their data. Keep in mind, if the authors of a well-funded randomized controlled trial don't need a long intro, neither do you. Methods. The methods section may be the longest section, competing only with the discussion. The exact contents of the methods section will change slightly based on which type of paper is to be written. A general rule of thumb to keep in mind, regardless of whether you're doing a randomized controlled trial, a systematic review, or a level 4 case series, is there should be sufficient detail that someone who wanted to repeat your study could easily do so simply by reading your methods section. I'll focus here on what most every methods section should contain, but will be biased a little towards retrospective studies as they are the most commonly written by residents and fellows as part of their training. The first few sentences/paragraphs should include general information about the study. An IRB statement should be present regarding ethics board approval or exemption. Many journals will require the actual IRB approval number to appear in the paper as part of the methods, and we generally recommend it here. The exact type of study should be present along with a statement of goals in the setting, time frame, and population of interest. For example, you might say, we performed a retrospective matched case control study to compare clinical outcomes and complications of pediatric tibial shaft fractures treated with casting versus MIPO plating treated at our level 1 pediatric trauma hospital from 2010 to 2019. Next, if your study is comparative and inferential, i.e. you are trying to make an inference about the general population from your population, you would include a power analysis which would be based on your primary outcome of interest. Next, a description of inclusion and exclusion criteria should be included. The focus on these is honing in on your target population you want to make inferences about. Inclusion and exclusion criteria are a huge source of bias and also reviewer comments. Be sure that you are well aware of why you have included, and maybe more importantly, excluded who you have. Remember that excluding patients limits your external validity and also may result in bias, but if done well, can assist with the internal validity of your study. For example, if your study is about adults, you would want to explicitly exclude children. See Module 5 for more detail. Description of primary dependent and independent variables. These are the most important variables and the variables that you are trying to compare for your study. See Module 2 for more details. The primary dependent variable will usually be the outcome variable and take the form of a patient-reported outcome, a radiographic measurement, complication, cost, length of stay, etc. The primary independent variable will most often be a procedure, a change in technique in a procedure, a change in venue, operator experience, implant, or any number of things. Dependent and independent variables should be described in exhaustive detail, how they are assessed, how they are measured, what protections for misclassification bias, see Module 4, or measurement error, see Module 5 and 6, you use to protect the integrity of your results. Your description of the dependent and independent variables should be waterproof enough that an editor or reader can see that you took prudent protections against bias, confounding, and chance. Retrospective studies are biased by their nature, and painstaking attention is needed to assure that all possible bias is protected against to the largest extent possible. Follow-up should be described in detail along with losses to follow-up. In clinical studies, there are many ways to report follow-up, some of which can result in biased estimates. Most importantly, follow-up should be long enough that the final outcome of interest could have reasonably happened by the time of final follow-up. For example, if the goal is to compare times to union for a pediatric fracture, 3 to 6 months should be more than enough time that 99% of fractures should have healed. If, on the other hand, you are looking at revision of a hip prosthesis that on average takes 15 years to loosen, you would likely need 20 or more years of follow-up to make meaningful comparisons with that metric. Competing interests are also important to keep in mind. In the aforementioned study regarding hip prosthesis loosening, if this is an older population, death may be a competing outcome that is a non-negligible component of the patients. This should be kept in mind when designing and reporting the time to follow-up. Description of the surgical procedure. If there is a surgical procedure, enough detail must be given for someone with similar training to recognize what is being done and understand the procedure in the setting of the surgery and compare in their mind to know if it is similar enough with the procedure that they do for the study to be generalizable to their practice. All relevant post-procedure information should be included, including post-operative protocol, splinting, bracing, weight-bearing status follow-up, and general physical therapy regimen. A description of relevant confounders should be discussed, and/or secondary outcomes explored. A discussion, at least in statistical methods, of how confounders were dealt with, either through statistical adjustment, stratification, or matching. Confounders are discussed further in Module 4. Statistical methods should be described in enough detail for a reader to recognize what tests are being used and why. Are parametric tests or non-parametric tests being used? Why? Which specific tests were selected? Were corrections for multiple tests employed? If so, which ones? Was a multivariate analysis performed? How is it designed? How is it modified? How is it assessed? What constituted significance? How was missing data dealt with if there was enough of it? The statistical package should be listed along with the city and state of the company that made the program. Results. The structure of the results should be centered around the research question. The writer should avoid the temptation to bloviate excessively. And excess results that are not clinically interesting or pertinent to the main question may not be helpful in telling the story of your paper and conveying the main idea for your message. In general, it is helpful to discipline oneself to a one-to-one question and answer style to your results section. Additional results may be in tables that are briefly referred to, but your results paragraphs themselves should be restricted to answering your research question or questions. If you have a primary outcome, for example, one paragraph may discuss this, whereas the next may discuss your secondary outcomes. A third paragraph may have new or unexpected results, but this paragraph should not detract from your main findings. The questions posed in the introduction should have a yes or no answer, and ambiguity from confounding may be addressed through multivariate analysis, Various techniques are available to assess the quality or fit of a multivariate model and help decide the strength of your yes or no. Remember, in a retrospective study, this will be correlative, and in an experimental study, this will be causative. A note about results. If you say something is increased or decreased relative to something else, this should include a p-value or non-overlapping confidence intervals. Reporting of confidence intervals generally also includes a p-value, but the confidence intervals provide more information about central tendency and dispersion than a simple p-value. Similarly, saying something is significantly more or less than something else implies that a statistical test has been done and that the p-value is less than a threshold, usually 0.05. The discussion section is one of the most free-form sections, and as such it is easy to get carried away with unnecessary detail. It is important to stay focused on the main goals of the paper, which can be broken down into 5 steps. 1. Restate the question or problem and why it is important. 2. State the main findings of the study. 3. Contextualize those findings in the framework of the broader literature. 4. Discuss weaknesses and limitations of the study. 5. State the conclusions of the study. Step 1. Restate the problem or question. This goal is much the same as the paragraph in the introduction, although at this point some more detail may be brought in, framing your question from past studies and literature. Consider the study of anterior vertebral body tethering. The authors present the problem or question, and in the final sentence present their contribution. In the middle sentences, the study distinguishes itself from past studies with the longer-term follow-up. Step 2. State the findings of the study. Here, you restate what your results found and why you think they are important and why they are valid. Consider this study of placement of pedicle screws with navigation. The research question being, are screws placed with navigation placed with a more ideal trajectory than those placed without navigation? Pause the video if you need to read the paragraphs. In these 2 paragraphs, the first details how more screws were placed in optimal trajectory with navigation, and the second details some of the non-optimal screws. The third paragraph, not shown, discusses potentially unsafe screws. Each has to do with a different facet of the research question. Step 3. Contextualize your results in the context of the broader literature. You should discuss what other authors have found and how it is the same or different from your current study. It is best not to make value judgments about previous studies, although it is permissible to make observations about design flaws of other studies as possible explanations for the differences. Slightly different populations, or bias, or confounding can be reasons for differences in results. Consider this RCT of operatively treated ankle fractures comparing early to late weight bearing. The authors use their first paragraph to restate the question and highlight their findings. This paragraph deals with what other similar level of evidence studies regarding the same question have found. Please pause the video if you'd like to read their paragraph. Depending on how many research questions there might be some blending of Step 2 and Step 3 in the paragraphs. Step 4. Limitations. It is important to discuss limitations of the current study. Pay particular attention to the limitations which could hamper the results of the study or compromise the study in terms of bias, confounding, and chance. It is also helpful to discuss how you attempted to mitigate these factors. It's very important to defend strongly your design decisions about your study. Many a study were made or broken for a journal of higher or lower impact than it deserved by the writing of the limitations section. Reviewers will look at this section very closely and about your justifications. Again, pause the video if you wish to look at this limitations section. This study of a classification of pediatric diaphyseal femur fractures was done with mixed methodology. The limitation section needed to be robust to defend the design decisions that went into attempting to answer the question. The more creative the design solution, likely the more well-crafted the limitations section will need to be. The limitations section should not be excuses, but rather your solution to unique design challenges posed by your research question. The reviewers will not see the forest for the trees. The onus is on you to show them the big picture. Conclusions. You can only conclude what your data showed. It is helpful to synthesize the results of the current study with past studies to formulate a more complete conclusion. Without a formal synthesis of the literature, findings of a single study can be easily refuted. Consider this conclusion paragraph of a study of epidemiology of children's fractures during COVID-19. Again, please pause the video if you wish to read. This study showed a dramatic reduction in children's fractures presenting to the office in ED during the pandemic. The authors state their conclusions just as the data showed. What they do not do is theorize why this is the case. They only state what the data showed. This is good because the data cannot be debated. They also state some practical recommendations based on the data, but do not indulge in theories of causality. This is an observational study only, and as such would not be able to demonstrate causality. In spite of that, their recommendations are both data-driven and clinically useful. Tables and figures. Tables and figures can be used creatively. In terms of figures, generally stay away from x-rays unless they provide a specific, instructive message related to the question. Figures are better used in papers for data visualization, a way to augment your message, not to confuse it. I view tables as a vehicle for conveying results, and it is a hierarchy. Main results related to your question or sub-questions should be in the results section text and be emphasized, so when the reader is reading the paper, they can very clearly see the main results. Tables should provide relevant surrounding details, but with data that are in more detail than you would want in the results, i.e. they risk the reader drowning in numbers and losing interest or missing the point by reading them. You still need the data in there, but you need it less for your main point than the actual results text. Appendices are for data that are circumstantial or too cluttered to belong in results or tables. Particularly interested readers can get this data, or readers who are doing systematic reviews or meta-analysis may want it, but it doesn't belong in the paper itself because it's too peripheral or off message. Abstract. You might think it's weird that I put this last, but it really should be a synopsis of your paper. One study showed that readers only read the abstract of 63% of papers, and this study reviewed internists. My bet is the result would be way higher with orthopedists and surgeons. Remember, this is SportsCenter. This may be all you have to grab the reader's interest. Have an interesting title, one that makes the reader want to read more. State your question clearly in the background and intro. Only list key parts of the methods. What type of study, how many patients, how much follow-up, what metrics are used for outcomes. Avoid a detailed treatise of statistical methods or you will lose many people. Results. Only list key results, only the most important findings, the things you would want on a press release. Conclusion. Similar to the conclusion and discussion, based only on data but should grab the reader enough to make them want to know more. Things I've learned over the years about writing to the review process. Keep the reviewer in mind. Try to predict what the reviews would be. Read your paper not like something you toiled over several hundred hours, but as someone busy who is reading it and has 10 to 15 minutes to make a decision. Create a narrative, preferably one with a maximum of 3 major points, and keep hitting them so they are burned in the reader's brain by the end. Know the strengths and weaknesses of the study and use the study design to minimize the weaknesses and maximize the strengths to convince the reviewers that you did this. Don't annoy the reviewer and editor with excess information or useless text. They are busy, they want to hear you out and be done. Triage your information with the most important being up front and center and the lesser being relegated to tables or appendices. Data visualization is awesome, particularly in the setting of surgical studies. Surgeons tend to be very visual, and as such we understand things better with data visualization. This will score points with reviewers and editors. Don't try to do too much with one paper. If you have enough important things to say, write more than one paper. Even if one goes into an index journal and another doesn't, the more lean approach is better. Think of it as a car towing a trailer. Will the car perform better towing a large load or no load? It's the same with papers. Excess information not related to the primary question can hamper a paper's success by causing reviewers and editors not to understand what you're trying to say. Please put questions in the comments section.